I was not given an explanation for what social media policy had violated or what tweet had violated policy, and I still have not received an explanation.
Last week, the Associated Press fired a journalist critical of Israel's extremist right-wing government. A ridiculous decision that, of course, has now backfired, as other AP journalists are publicly calling out their own employer, and AP themselves are now running damage control in an attempt to maintain morale. Now, I'm going to go over the timeline here, as well as get to a clip of the journalist who was fired and what she has said about it, and also get to, of course, the fallout from all of this. So first, let me show you how this all started. Emily Wilder is the employee who was fired, started a new job at the Associated Press on May 3rd. Just 16 days later, she was called and told that she had been terminated for violating the company's social media policy. More on that in a minute. First, Wilder, who is Jewish, said AP's decision to fire her felt like a convenient cover story for sacrificing me as collateral after conservative outlets and lawmakers branded her as anti-Israel and slammed the news organization for hiring her. So let me get to some comments here from Emily Wilder herself and what she thinks about this whole situation.
Last Monday, a group from my alma mater, the Stanford College Republicans, began to post online past posts that I had made on social media in an attempt to expose my history of activism for Palestinian human rights while I was an undergraduate at Stanford University, and in an attempt to link AP to Hamas. In the next 2 days, I began to receive a lot of harassment, a lot of pretty heinous harassment, as well as prominent Republicans on the internet began to lambaste me, including Senator Tom Cotton and Ben Shapiro. I was reassured during this time by my editors that I would not face repercussions for my past activism and that they just wanted to support me while I was facing the smear campaign. But less than 48 hours after the Stanford College Republicans began to post about me, I was fired. The reason given was a supposed social media violation sometime after I joined AP on May 3rd. I was not given an explanation for what social media policy had violated or what tweet had violated policy, and I still have not received an explanation.
So there she gives you the breakdown of what happened, and still, the AP have not told her specifically why she was fired. They just say, oh, because of our social media policy, but they don't point to a specific tweet or something she said online that led to her getting fired. Now, of course, as we'll get to later, this has led to outrage among people that actually work, other people that work at AP, and the damage control that AP has now been forced to run because of all of this going on, because of this firing. But it's also worth mentioning here that you have someone who actually has principles, has a motivation, wants to stand up for human rights. That's what her activism was about in college. She stood up for Palestinian lives. And she's been fired because of that. Now, it's one thing to argue, should someone be fired over something they said in the past? I mean, she's still fairly young, so college for her was a couple of years ago. But let's say it was something that was actually bad. Let's say or not even just Emily, but in general, let's say somebody said something online that was terrible and their job found out about it, that they did this tweet 5 years ago and they fired them. I think that's wrong on the face of it. If that person has changed, they've apologized and they've moved on from that, I don't think it makes any sense to let go of somebody because of something they said online 5 years ago. But that isn't even the case in this situation. We're talking about somebody who has shown a willingness, a fight to stand up for the lives of Palestinians, for human rights. So what AP is doing here is essentially saying, we don't want to hire anybody who actually cares about human life. We simply want stenographers who have never held an opinion their entire lives and are simply going to report both sides without bringing in any objective facts or analysis. It's a completely ridiculous standard that simply leads to watered down coverage on every issue. If all you're going to if what you're putting out there is you're telling young journalists, you're telling students that we're not going to hire you if you've ever shown a willingness to stand up for human life, we're not going to hire you if you've ever stood up against a powerful regime. We only want to hire you if you've never said anything of any substance online in your entire life. That's completely ridiculous. Why would you want somebody without any character, without any actual stance, without any principles? So it's the complete opposite of what journalists should be doing. So Emily Wilder, I assume she'll be fine because this is somebody who actually, again, has principles, actually cares. I'm sure someone else who's smart will hire her and be able to utilize her. But it is completely insane what the AP did here. Just to give you an example of some of her tweets before she was fired, or one of the tweets anyways. She tweeted out on May 16th, "Objectivity feels fickle when the basic terms we use to report news implicitly stake a claim. Using Israel but never Palestine, or war but not siege and occupation are political choices. Yet media make those exact choices all the time without being flagged as biased." This is such a great point. This is how the media often will make you feel a certain way about an issue without you even realizing that they did it. It's the way that they frame these discussions. So using war makes it sound like to the average reader that, oh, this is an equal battle. You have these two sides fighting it out. But the accurate way to describe what's happening in Israel-Palestine is siege and occupation, where you have one side that has all the power, that has the backing of the world superpowers, versus a people that are living in an open-air prison in Gaza where Israel controls the borders. That is not a war. That is an occupation and siege. But the way the media portrays these issues as neutral as possible actually does a disservice into educating people to think the completely wrong thing about the issue. So if they actually treated it at mass media at large, actually communicated these issues the way they should, by using terms like siege and occupation, then we would have a more educated populace. But because they treat these issues more as neutral fights as opposed to objective reality and looking at human rights and what side we should be standing up for, then lots of people, at least up to this point, again, media has shifted a lot over the course of the last month on this issue. But up to this point, the media has always communicated this story as both sides as opposed to looking at the clear power imbalance at the heart of it. So I just want to share this one quote as well here from Emily Wilder, who said, quote, "It's terrifying as a young woman who was hung out to dry when I needed support from my institution most. And it's enraging as a Jewish person who grew up in a Jewish community, attended Orthodox schooling, and devoted my college years to studying Palestine and Israel, that I could be defamed as anti-Semitic and thrown under the bus in the process," she wrote. So, I mean, this is the whole other side of it. The idea that you're going to call somebody who is Jewish, attended Orthodox schooling, devoted her college years to studying Palestine and Israel, you're going to call that person anti-Semitic for actually understanding the issue, understanding the power imbalance, understanding the human rights at the heart of this? Completely ridiculous. Also worth mentioning here that, of course, this firing happened just a couple days after Israel bombed the building that houses the Associated Press in Gaza. I cannot think of a way to communicate how weak you are than by firing a journalist who is critical of Israel just a couple days after Israel bombed your own offices. Now, the fallout from all of this. You now have 100 plus AP staffers condemning news agency for sacrifice of Emily Wilder after right-wing smear campaign. Wilder's firing has left AP employees wondering how we treat our own, what culture we embrace, and what values we truly espouse as a company. So you have a lot of journalists here that work at the AP pissed off over the firing of Emily Wilder because they correctly recognize if she can be fired for standing up for human rights in college, then what can we be fired for? So they released a statement. Again, I'll link to all these sources below the video so you can read through all of this. But let me just read this quote here. "We need to know that the AP would stand behind and provide resources to journalists who are the subject of smear campaigns and online harassment. As journalists who cover contentious subjects, we are often the target of people unhappy with scrutiny. What happens when they orchestrate a smear campaign targeting another one of us?" So it's important to point out here, the reason Emily Wilder was fired was because of that smear campaign from right-wing organizations and individuals. So they gave in to pressure, from dishonest pressure from the right, and fired her because of that, just days after their own office was bombed by the Israeli government. Now, due to this open letter and these staffers being pissed off, the AP has now been forced to run damage control internally. So the Intercept headline here, AP and leaked memos doing damage control with staff, quote, "You will have a voice." So here the AP is forced now, of course, to run damage control, trying to convince their employees that, no, don't worry, we're going to listen to you. We're going to have this running dialogue. So if you're worried that you may be fired, well, you'll understand what is and isn't okay on social media, even though they still have not said specifically why Emily Wilder was fired. They are now trying to claim that, oh, we're going to be more open, more clear with you. Again, I'm not going to read through this piece, but you can read through it. It's the same BS you hear all the time from these organizations whenever any sort of event like this happens. And notice how they always give in to right-wing pressure, but never to the left. The left that actually has serious criticisms, honest criticisms of mainstream media coverage, of the lack of a voice for human rights, of the lack of an analysis of corporate power over politics. That's left-wing pressure. Right-wing pressure is being dishonest and smearing somebody because they stood up for Palestinians, for human rights in college, and getting a person fired because of that. And then the right will go and say, oh, the left is all about cancel culture, but here we are piling on someone to get them fired, even though this is a person who actually has principles and cares about the issues and cares about people. So once again, you have a organization here, a media organization, giving in to right-wing pressure while continuing to suppress left-wing voices and human rights.